All right, Brandon, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself, and thank you again for presenting for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Steve. So my name is Brendon Lee, and I am a senior program manager with Microsoft in the compliance CXE CAT org, which is essentially the way you can look at it is like the customer-facing arm of the product group, right? Our responsibility is to work with customers and to try to kind of funnel and take insights and information back to the product group so that we can help design how products are developed, as well as shape those products in the future. So today I have one of my colleagues, Patrick David, on the call as well. He will be answering some questions, or at least providing the questions for the end, and we'll try to leave some time for answering questions there. So today we're going to be talking about Microsoft Information Governance, and we're going to kind of lace that into a new feature that we have coming out as actually in public preview as of yesterday and currently rolling out to tenants as we speak. So actually the tenant that I'm using for the demo did not have it yesterday, and then today I logged in and it does. So if you don't have it in your tenant, you should within the next couple of days or so. So we're going to start out with a high-level overview of what Microsoft Information Governance is and where it's useful. Then we'll introduce that new capability I was talking about, adaptive scopes or adaptive policy scopes. We'll talk about what it is, how it's going to help add flexibility to deploying policies, and how it can enhance existing policy experience. And then we're going to do a live demo to showcase the power of adaptive policy scopes, which I tried to use some examples that you may run into in the education sector. So let's begin with a quick overview of what Microsoft Information Governance is. So organizations have, a lot of data, and it's becoming even more complicated and difficult to identify the types of data that exist within an organization's boundaries. Years ago, much of the data associated with organizations was generally paper-based. It could physically be governed, stored, archived, or destroyed. But today, the reality is the data is not only paper-based, but even more so digital. So governing this data can present challenges, as not only do the locations that store the data have to be identified, but also the type of data needs to be identified as well and governed appropriately. For example, this data may and probably does include personal data, which may be subject to data protection laws and regulations, or records, which are like the memories of an organization, and as such must be protected from modification. And it's not all about keeping data either. Data hoarding has recently become a huge problem for organizations, as data is so easily created, saved, and integrated. Many people actually have personal accounts and data stored on the machine that they use for work, and vice versa, use personal machines to access work resources. And schools are not immune from this either. In fact, I'd argue that they are even more so at risk, as students and staff can have many different types of unintended personal data stored within the school's boundaries, such as personal pictures or financial aid documentation and applications. In fact, the amount of data that we have stored today is expected to more than double every 2 years. This is a lot of information, right? And a lot of potential risks. So it's more critical than ever to start governing that data within the organization. And Microsoft wants to help do that by providing some simple tools which can understand and react to this exponentially increasing risk. So on average, Microsoft 365 cloud organizations are managing 5 different content systems and repositories. We have SharePoint, Exchange, Teams, OneDrive, and Yammer. Information is duplicated across these various locations or workloads. And as we mentioned, information exponentially grows as users continue to create content. Microsoft Information Governance is designed to apply global policies that can reach across all 5 of the major workloads, governing data where it's created, in order to prevent productivity loss and or reduce operational and legal risks. In addition, Microsoft 365 provides automated governance policies to help reduce the risk of non-compliance due to inadvertent or malicious mishandling of data. Additionally, many regulations such as 17A-4 and FINRA require organizations to meet stringent governance requirements such as record immutability, as well as provide proof that a defensible process for content disposal was followed. Microsoft 365 provides transparent insights into how data is classified to help your organization audit and fine-tune classification policies. Moreover, the records management capabilities within Microsoft Information Governance can help organizations follow a defensible process to retain and dispose of information with proof of disposals, disposition reviews, and rich audit trails. And finally, we understand and acknowledge that all of our customers' data is not within just the Microsoft 365 cloud infrastructure. That's why we also provide pre-built data connectors built by Microsoft and third-party partners to provide access to data that's stored in third-party systems. And if a pre-built connector doesn't exist, customers or partners can build their own custom connectors to continuously ingest data into Microsoft 365 for governance and protection. Now, Microsoft Information Governance provides multiple ways that you can classify data and enforce governance policies. Admins can, from a basic level, set up organization-wide policies called retention policies, which are container-based and easy to deploy across entire solutions. They can also deploy retention labels, which can be used to apply governance to individual files within a location rather than the entire location. In addition, organizations can leverage the service's automation to auto-apply policies and labels. Auto-applying a label, for example, can be based on the file's metadata or property. You can also auto-apply labels based on if the file contains specific keywords or leverage pattern recognition technology to identify files containing sensitive information. Currently provide more than 200 out-of-the-box patterns that are ready for use, such as credit card numbers, password numbers, etc. Additionally, we now have trainable classifiers, which can identify files that look like a particular content using machine learning models. It can be especially helpful in identifying documents like resumes or any other content that can't be easily found using pattern recognition. Customers can also leverage the machine learning powered classifiers to create their own classifiers tailored to their organization. We strive to give customers the greatest amount of flexibility to apply governance to the data wherever it lives, whether it's retaining for a period of time, preventing modification, and or destroying after the data's useful lifetime has expired. One additional concept that I wanted to cover here regarding Microsoft Information Governance is the principles of retention. These basic principles define the underlying algorithm that's used to define how retention and deletion should work in times that there are conflicts. So understanding the principles of retention is vital to understanding how Microsoft's governance platform functions and how the outcomes of the platform can or should meet your organization's expectations. In fact, many organizations end up with unexpected results simply because they misunderstood or didn't plan deployment according to the principles of retention. At a basic level, these principles are used to help determine conflict resolution. For example, when multiple policies affect a single item or location. So they start from the top to the bottom, and generally, when there's retention applied, retention will always win over deletion. So for example, if you have something that has 10-year retention and then something that has 5-year retention that apply to the same item or location, the 10-year retention is always going to take precedence. That's number one. Now, if the conflict remains after that retention always wins principle is applied, then the next thing we look at is what is the longest retention period, and that will win. For example, we have a 5-year retention applied to something and a 10-year retention applied to something. The 10-year retention is going to always take precedence in that case because that is the longest retention period. But what if retention no longer applies or was never specified? In that case, first, we're going to look at the explicit and implicit, whether it's explicitly or implicitly defined on the file. So explicit deletion will always win over implicit deletion. For example, if you have a deletion policy that's applied to an individual item explicitly, it's always going to take precedence over a retention policy that's been inherited by the item that's applied to the location and tells it to apply a deletion rule. Then finally, if no previous principle applies, then the shortest deletion period will be used to resolve the conflict. For example, if you have two implicit deletion policies, so maybe two retention policies that apply to the same location and have a delete action, because they're both implicit, we're going to fall back to whichever policy has the shortest amount of deletion time. So once you're able to wrap your head around these principles of retention, you start to understand a lot better how things work when it comes to information governance within Microsoft 365, and you can deploy, you can plan your deployments and everything based on that. All right. I wanted to discuss this newest feature that I talked about briefly, which is, like I said, currently rolling out into public preview, and it's called adaptive policy scopes. The whole idea behind adaptive policy scopes is to enhance the flexibility and the capabilities that are currently exist with policies in Microsoft Information Governance, and we're going to talk about how adaptive policy scopes does that. So before we do that, let's quickly cover what creating a retention policy or a retention label policy looks like without adaptive policy scopes. So you have two main decisions right now, right? What do you want to do? Such as, do you want to retain, do you want to delete, or do you want to do both? Then where do you want that action to apply? So you can choose a workload, for example, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. But there may be situations where it's not easy to say an entire location needs to have the same settings. For example, we may have situations where geographic locations or regions or even departments determine where a policy and its settings need to be applied. For example, you may want to apply a policy to faculty, but a different policy to students. So we offer the ability to include or exclude specific locations within workloads, such as targeting specific numbers of sites or excluding, a handful of mailboxes from an entire location policy. However, even with inclusion and exclusion rules configured, these types of policies are very static in nature. There's very little flexibility for those complex scenarios where a more dynamic behavior is needed. Furthermore, there's currently limits that apply to policies that use those inclusion and exclusion rules, which can be problematic for larger organizations such as a school. Generally, if your location applies to a mailbox, such as an Exchange mailbox, Microsoft 365 Groups, Teams, or Yammer location, the static scope policies will have a limit of 1,000 locations per policy if you use inclusion or exclusion rules. For site-based locations, such as SharePoint and OneDrive, the limitations are a bit more restrictive at 100 locations for policies. So what this means is for an organization that has, let's say, 5,000 specific mailboxes to apply a retention policy out of an organization of 10,000 users, admins would then be forced to create 5 different retention policies, each with 1,000 included mailboxes. As you can imagine, that can be very rigid and restrictive, and simply does not work in very large organizations like school systems or colleges. And then, if you use a distribution group to specify the locations, the 1,000 limit still applies, and the expansion of that distribution group only occurs at the time the policy is created or modified. So if we need to add or remove a location from the group, the policy must be updated to re-expand the group, which adds additional administrative overhead. Because of that rigidness and lack of flexibility, we've now labeled this experience static scopes. But static scopes are not all bad. In fact, they do work in very specific situations, such as those where an entire location needs to be included in an org-wide blanket type policy. Or if you have a small number of inclusions or exclusions which don't change often over time, such as if you maybe need to exclude a board member from an entire location policy. But as more organizations continue to invest in their cloud infrastructure, they're there's a growing number of scenarios where static scopes just aren't cutting it, such as when you need, when there's a large number of dynamically updating included or excluded locations, for example, students who may only be with the school for a short period of time. Now, OneDrive is particularly susceptible to misconfiguration here, as the URLs are based on the UPN. So if the UPN changes for any reason, which could be a new domain name, a department change, or a departure from the organization, the URL will change and potentially not match what's specified in an inclusion or exclusion rule. So naturally, this is where we have identified this gap. And after a lot of incredible feedback from our customers, we're excited to announce this new dynamic option to choose from when you're building your retention-based policies. And that new dynamic option is called Adaptive Policy Scopes. So adaptive policy scopes can offer administrative relief in these dynamic and complex scoping scenarios by providing dynamic automatic policy inclusion or exclusion based on an easy to configure, synchronized attributes and properties. So additionally, with adaptive scopes, those inclusion and exclusion limits we discussed before no longer apply, meaning one policy can apply to 5,000 users in the UK campus without needing to create 5 different policies. You can just have one single policy there. And while we understand the dynamic nature of adaptive scopes can add some complexity and administrative overhead when troubleshooting policy administration, a new policy lookup tool is also going to be available with adaptive scopes, which allows you to identify which policies, both retention policies and retention label policies, apply to a user, site, or group at any given time based on the attributes or properties the scope applies. Now, with adaptive scopes, there's really 3 different types of scopes that you can create, each type supporting specific locations and specific attributes or properties that you can scope to. And I'll show this in the demo a little bit better so you can get a better idea of what I mean here. But really, the 3 different types of scopes that you have are user scopes, which are going to be targeting Azure AD user objects. You have group scopes, which target Azure AD group objects, and you have site scopes, which target SharePoint sites, right? So each of these different types have various attributes or properties that you can scope to, and they're not necessarily the same across them, but they are very flexible, especially since custom attributes are supported and property bag values for SharePoint. So you have the ability to add in your own custom information and then filter based on that. And we're going to do that in the demo as well. To provide even greater flexibility, we have operators that are available as well for combining or scoping attributes even further. There are also 2 different types of query options as well. You can use the simple query builder, which provides like a GUI experience for building a scope, or you can use the advanced query builder, where you can use OPath for user and group scopes and KQL for site scopes to build those queries. Now, you may be asking yourself, then what changes? Will I have, to relearn a new policy wizard? Not at all. We've simply added the decision to use either an adaptive scope or a static scope to the policy wizard itself. So as we discussed before, static scopes do have benefits. We aren't replacing static scopes, rather enhancing the process to give admins the choice based on the type of policy, type of locations, and the use case for governance that is needed. So before I jump into a demo, I wanted to check to see if there was any questions about what we are talking about so far.
Nothing inside the chat window as of yet.
Oh, okay. Awesome. So let me spin up my little demo here. And I did spin up an education tenant for this demo. So I'm going to jump over to Information Governance tab. You'll see we have now this Adaptive Scopes preview and Policy Lookup preview tab. Now, with EDU, and I wanted to create some scenarios that were specific to EDU and more specifically higher education that you may be able to solve with adaptive scopes, right? And the first scenario that I came up with was the difference between students and faculty, right? Generally, your education tenants will have both students and faculty potentially within the same tenant, right? That can make targeting retention difficult. And, you know, especially if you're a larger school, you're going to have a very, very hard time with those limits that we discussed before of 1,000 user objects per policy. So along those lines, something that has come up of recently that's been a very hot topic is inactive mailboxes, right? So as you may or may not know, but when somebody leaves the organization and that user object is deleted, if there's some kind of hold, like whether it's a retention policy or an e-discovery policy or e-discovery hold on a mailbox, it gets converted to what's called an inactive mailbox. Now, whenever either that, whatever, if it's a retention policy, that retention policy is either going to retain for a period of time and then stop retaining, or it's going to retain for a period of time and then delete. However, in both of those cases, the inactive mailbox still kind of sticks around, right? The best case scenario there is that we apply a deletion action to the retention policy. And what that'll do is at least remove the data after a period of time, but the mailbox just kind of is stubbed there and still sticks around as an inactive mailbox just with no data in it. So with that best scenario or best case scenario in mind, adaptive scopes give you the ability to now create these retention policies that can be targeting towards your students and even your inactive mailboxes, or not really your inactive mailboxes, but your users that are leaving the organization or your students that are leaving the school, so that you can apply like a deletion rule after a period of time. So we're going to kind of walk through that, and I'll show you what I've come up with for that sort of scenario. So let's go into the Adaptive Scopes preview tab. And I'm going to click Create a Scope. And I'm going to name this scope Students. And we'll just give this a description of student user accounts. As I mentioned before, we have 3 different options. We can choose User Scope, Site Scope, or Microsoft 365 Group Scope. In this case, I'm looking at inactive mailboxes. I'm looking at user accounts and OneDrive data as well that I want to set up a deletion policy for. So we can click Users, Next. Now, as you can see, this is what we call the simple query builder. I can here add any of these attributes that I want that are listed here. And that allows me to create these somewhat complex queries, right? So I can say, for example, department is equal to, whatever, add additional attributes to further scope it down. However, we also have this advanced query builder, and this is something that I'm urging more and more customers to consider using. And there's a couple of reasons why. So first, when you use the simple query builder, it allows you to use what's called OPath, right, to define that query. OPath is, actually, let me open up another tab and show you. OPath is a filtering language that's available within Exchange Online, and it allows you a lot more attributes that you can filter on. I mean, this is all the stuff you can filter on with OPath. And if you remember, when I dropped down that list in the GUI, these were not all in there, right? So you have a lot more flexibility, a lot more customization that you can use with OPath. The other reason is when you create a query, it takes up to 24 hours for us to populate that scope. So you're not going to see in the GUI any results for up to 24 hours. However, if you use OPath, you can just use PowerShell to see the results immediately. That way you get to validate your query, and you know that whenever it does start populating, it's going to actually have the right data in it. So let's show that. And I tried to make this big without making it obnoxiously big. So hopefully you can see this with me sharing my screen. So really the easiest way that I found to identify students for faculty versus faculty is using their Microsoft 365 license, right? Generally, someone has a student license or a faculty license. So what I did was created a simple script, literally a few lines of code that would copy that license that is specified within their MSOL user account to one of the custom attributes that we have in Exchange or really Azure AD. So custom attribute 1. So if I go and run get mailbox and output the name and custom attribute 1, you can see my script has automatically populated A5 student, A5 faculty for all the users based on what they have configured for a license. Now what I can do is use OPath to build that query, right, and test it directly within PowerShell. So I can say get mailbox with a filter, custom attribute 1 equals M365 E5 A5 student, which is my license type, and then output in that same way. And that's going to give me just the students, basically. So I have my path query right here. I know it works. So I can simply now go back in here and I can add that query that I created into this OPath box, hit next, and then submit. And it will create that scope, which will start populating, like I said, within 24 hours with all the users that we just showed in PowerShell. So we were very quickly able to create this scope that targets some sort of custom value that's important to us and is able to scope down the amount of users based on that custom value. I don't have to wait for it to start populating. I can go ahead and just create a retention policy. So I'm going to go ahead and click new retention policy, and we're going to say student retention policy, and we'll say this thing, so retain and delete OneDrive content after 5 years. That way we're a 4-year school. They're here for 4 years. It gives them an extra year just in case. The next screen, you're going to see adaptive scopes or static scopes. If you click static scopes, it takes you to the old you're used to seeing with the policy, or I'm sorry, location picker, right? But if we choose adaptive scopes, I then have the ability to choose the scope that I just created. So I can click add scope, add students, and as you can see, it automatically filters down based on the type of scope to what locations I want this policy to apply, right? I can choose Exchange and OneDrive, which, by the way, OneDrive is huge because if you remember, we were limited to 100 OneDrive sites using the old or the static scope method. You can also choose Teams chats, channel messages, and Yammer messages, but those, just like normal, have to be a separate policy from Exchange and OneDrive. Click next, and let's say we want to retain for 5 years and then delete the items automatically. That way, whenever the users has left the school, right, the data will be cleared out after about a year or so from the inactive mailbox. And then I can click submit. Now, if I wanted to create a policy that was specific to those inactive users, right, or to those users that are leaving the school, I could potentially maybe set up use another custom attribute. We have 15 of them, plus we have the custom extension attributes as well, which are multi-property values, or multi-value property, excuse me. So you can use, we have tons of customizability here that you can use. You could use one of those custom attributes to specify that the user's inactive, right? That'll allow you to then even further scope down to just those users that are leaving the school, allow the policy to apply to those users before you remove the license and delete them. And then their inactive mailbox will be governed as it's an inactive mailbox and cleared out over time. Second scenario that I wanted to talk about was Teams. So Teams is more popular or becoming more popular over the last few years, as I'm sure all of you know. So I wanted to try to include this into the adaptive scopes demo as well. So, but I didn't want to make it like I didn't want to use the same example that I just used for a user, because really when it comes down to it, we're still using OPath. It's still with an exchange, so we can still target those custom attributes and all that. So instead, what I wanted to do was give an example of maybe an automated process for students creating or requesting to create teams, which then triggers an approval process. And once approved, it creates a team in a way that we can then target with adaptive scopes. So that's what I did. I went ahead and created a form. And what it's asking is for students that are going to create this, they want to create a team, let's say for, I don't know, a computer geeks team or something. They can submit it here. It'll have to be approved, and then it'll automatically get created. It does indicate that it needs to be approved first. So I'm going to say my proposed name for the team will be Computer Geeks. And then the description that I want everybody to see within the team will be a team for all us computer geeks out there. So I'm going to go ahead and click submit, and it has then submitted the form just like any other form. Now, what I did within Power Automate is created a flow that triggers off of the submission of that form and looks up the user's profile and then starts an approval process, right? So it sends an approval to some group to go in and approve the creation of that team. So once it does that, if the approval is, if it's approved, then it'll create the team. It'll add that person that requested the team as an owner. Then it'll send an email. If not, then it'll send an email saying that the team creation request was denied. So if I go back here and I look at my run, you can see it's running, which means it's probably waiting for my approval. Let me jump over to OA. And we have an approval here for this Computer Geeks team. So I can go ahead and click approve here. It will take me to Power Automate approvals, where I can add a comment if I want, and then approve or deny that request. In this case, I'm going to select to approve it. And if we refresh here, this flow should now be going through, creating that team, then adding that user that requested the team to the new team as an owner, and then notifying me that it's been completed. I just got the ding in my ear that the new mail came in, which is the team approved and created email. So as you can see here, what I had the flow do was take that name that the customer or the student requested and just added an S in front of it, an S hyphen. That way we can say everything that's created with this form is student created. So we're going to add an S in front of it. That's something that we can easily target with an adaptive scope, right? So let's jump over to PowerShell again. And I'll clear this screen just to kind of get all the stuff off of it. Now, teams are basically, they're attached to a Microsoft 365 group, essentially, right? So they kind of, that's where all the team, structure and stuff is stored. The documents get stored within a SharePoint site that's also affiliated with the Microsoft 365 group, right? As you know, Microsoft 365 group has both an Exchange and a SharePoint side to it. So Get Unified Group is what you use to find the groups within the organization. I can run that. That outputs all of my groups. I have a few here. Now, just like before, we can use OPath with the filter command to look for all Microsoft 365 groups that start with S hyphen, because that's going to be our student created. And that brings us back to just these three groups, right? So we know that these three are student created. And now we can go and create maybe a deletion policy that applies to those three groups and any other group that gets created by a student using that form. So we'll jump back over to the Information Governance tab, jump over to Adaptive Scopes, and we're going to create a new scope. And we're going to call this one Student Created Teams. And we're going to say we're going to delete items or content within this team after 1 year, because generally students only need the teams for a year. That's maybe our policy or something. So in this case, we're going to, instead of choose users, we're going to choose groups. Next, again, I could use the simple query builder. If I wanted to do that, I would use name, starts with, and then S minus, right? In this case, however, I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to use OPath because I already have the OPath query that I've tested. And I'm going to use name like S minus asterisk for the wildcard. Done. Now I can jump back over to my retention policies. Create a new retention policy. Similar information. And choose adaptive again. We're going to add a scope for student created teams. And we can now choose Teams channel messages and also Yammer messages if you want. We can also apply a separate policy to the groups if you have groups that are also created. In this case, we're targeting essentially those teams. And we'll go ahead and hit next, and we'll say only delete items after here. 12 years, 1 year. And submit. So, but I used the wrong name here. So as you can see, adaptive scopes makes it really easy to scope down without those same limits that affected us with static policy scopes, and apply very flexible policies that are dynamic, right? As somebody is added to the school as a student, they're going to automatically get populated with that license, and they're automatically going to get included within that policy. Or if they leave or maybe they become like a faculty member, right? They get hired by the college. They'll then switch to a different license, which will then give them a different policy, right? So there's an endless amount of capabilities or things that you can do with adaptive scopes, and it allows you a lot of flexibility in doing that. I didn't mention as well that the demo I showed really retention policies. You can also use adaptive scopes with label policies and records management, right? So whether you're deploying manual labels, maybe you just want to deploy it to a certain department within the school, like finance department, or if you want to auto apply labels, but only want to apply it to a certain type of site, you can do that as well. Additionally, what I did not go over as well is setting up site adaptive scope. Want to filter, and I'll kind of go in here and show. If you want to filter on a site, you're a little limited out of the box because sites don't have Azure AD objects that are associated with them, right? They're a SharePoint specific object. So we can use site URL, we can use site name, but anything other than that, you're really going to be restricted to using refinable strings, which are indexed managed properties that are mapped to custom properties that you define within your sites. For example, if you had a department need, you could add a custom property for custom department and map that to one of these refinable strings and that to find the sites that you want. It's a little more complex, and we have documentation that's been published on how to do that and how to set all that up, with some plans to give some recommendations soon, as well as to how to maybe set up some provisioning solutions to assist with all that as well. So that is my presentation or my demo here. Have another slide here, just some resources. We have my team has created what's called DAGs, or deployment acceleration guides. There's one for each pillar, MIP, NDOP, MIG, RM, eDiscovery, IRCC, and they're all posted at that first link there. We also do regularly do webinars where we talk about some of these features, especially the newer features that we're planning to release. Sometimes we have the feature PMs come in and actually demo or talk about that feature. So if you click that link, it'll take you to our webinars page where you can see upcoming webinars as well as previous webinars. The recordings are there for you to review. And then we have some other links here, the blogs, the official documentation, some videos on our YouTube channel, and so forth. So that is it. Do we have any questions?
There was one question, but it's not of a technical nature. Is there a license requirement for any of these features? So I'm going to go out on a limb and say the stuff like the adaptive scopes and the setting of retention and stuff like that is probably an A5 feature. Is that correct?
Yeah, so adaptive scopes, yes. To use adaptive scopes, it is an A5 or equivalent feature, which means you could have an add-on or something that gives you that feature. For retention, basic retention does not require A5. You can do that with A3. The big thing is that you have, if you apply to a mailbox, that you have a license that includes the Exchange Online Plan 2 license, which allows you to apply retention to items. So it's like a rabbit hole, right? It gets really deep and complex. So try to stay away from licensing discussions. But adaptive scopes, yes, E5 as of right now.
Yeah. And I would suggest to Jeff, I think, oh no, Mark, sorry, reach out to your accountant team, and we can always have the licensing conversation with you at some later time, and break it down what you need, because as Brendon mentioned, there's, you don't have to go with the complete A5. There's different sub SKUs, and Microsoft doesn't try and make licensing easy, so we'll have to walk that through. Brian is asking a question. The scoping features here are beyond what the identity team is providing for AU scope definition. Any plans to shift these to AUs when they are more developed?
AUs, I'm not familiar with the
administrative units.
Okay. So right now, we really are reliant only on back-end functionality, right? So we're using OPath, which is an exchange feature for groups and users, and we're using KQL for SharePoint. It would be up to really the exchange or the SharePoint teams to extend what is available to, what's visible to those querying languages, because that's really what we're held back by.
All right. If anybody's got any questions, please come off mute and ask them now. And one thing I do want to do is get the URL for the survey, unless you have it off the top of your hand there, Caden.
Yep, I'm throwing it in right now.
Okay, perfect, great. So Caden's putting the link to the survey. Please do take the survey. And on that note, Brendon, I'm going to stop the recording.
Awesome.